Okay, so I'm currently in Swansea University and I'm exploring sort of fluctuating conditions of disability within the 19th century. Um, and so within this, there's conditions of visibility such as partial visibility, invisibility, and hypervisibility. Um, so basically, this is the overview. So we're going to be framing disability, discussing a little bit about consumption as an example of that, exploring the liminality of disability, and concluding. So visibility is really important to an individual's identity because it's linked to power through recognition, and therefore disability is important to approach and deconstruct when it comes to the concept of invisibility, because this is how it can impact intersectional identities within a society, especially a society that queries the existence and the rights of disabled people. So invisibility is a paradox because it exists within the social need to label and categorize things and people. So it has no meaning unless we consider visibility, and this creates a binary. And it does reflect other binaries found throughout numerous discourses. So for example, disability can't exist without ability, i.e. able-bodiedness, or as Leonard Davis has suggested, abnormality can't exist without societal norms. The problem is this binary is reductionist, and it should extend to include interstitial space. And so when these discourses are approached, for example, with visibility, it should be approached simultaneously with invisibility. And so in the context of this, when I'm discussing invisibility, I have a slash between invisibility, so in and visibility with a slash. And this shows both the duality and the interstitial space. And it's really important to kind of think about when I'm discussing invisibility repeatedly. So approaching this interstitial space is key to understanding how intersecting social identities could cause a person to experience paradoxical tensions in which they might feel like they belong to, but at the same time are distinct from a certain group. So age, gender, class can shape how historical figures have negotiated and experienced these tensions, and these tensions have led to the creation of conditions of visibility that shape and color how disabled people historically have been seen. So again, the idea of hypervisibility, partial visibility, and invisibility. So the 19th century is really key to this because the cultural prominence and the visibility of invalidism, which is a contemporary term at the time, arose due to many interlinking factors, from evangelicalism, which viewed illness as stemming from God and leading to spiritual transformation, to the rise of the industrialization, which led to changing ideas of productivity and the physical and mental performance of individuals. Medical science was also going through a transition period at this point, with improvements in healthcare that changed the narratives of illness and also transformed the understandings of certain illnesses across the century. So with this in mind, it's important to understand that at times I tend to use a postmodern social constructionist approach. So Chris Schilling has defined this as an umbrella term for those views that suggest the body is shaped, constrained, and even invented by society. And it's important to the social construction of disease and illness to consider how it's framed. Charles E. Rosenberg suggested that the framing of illness and disease can impact the perspective taken. So when illness is seen as a physical condition, the dates of key legislative and medical discoveries can be core to its understanding, such as the discovery of the etologic agent that causes tuberculosis. However, disease needs to be understood within the context. So certain time periods and societies will impact the behaviors, ideas, and practices around a disease, such as the apparent creative capabilities of those with consumption. Put simply, various conditions of visibility will impact disability and must be considered within the social time period. So obviously you can see here the difference between illness and disease and the importance of framing it. Consumption is a really good example for this. So consumption was a contemporary term for tuberculosis. It's a prime example of a social construction of disease in the 19th century. Consumptives were usually presented in a sympathetic light, and the disease was seen as being linked to spirituality, sensitivity, and virtue. And so this has been argued to have romanticized the disease. So in 1833, the London Medical and Surgical Journal described the disease in a really positive and romantic manner. They said that consumption, neither effacing the lines of personal beauty nor damaging the intellectual functions, tends to exalt moral habits and develop the amiable qualities of the patient. And Lord Byron, when asked by a friend, went on to say that he wanted to die from consumption, and was said to have said that this was because so many women will say how beautifully he is dying. So consumption as a whole was viewed from a romantic and aesthetic perspective, and it inspired many depictions in fiction, such as Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, poetry with Ode to a Nightingale, which reflected the lived experience of John Keats, who went on to die from the disease, and also art, such as The Sick Child, which you can see here in some of the various depictions of consumption at the time, which was by Edvard Munch and depicted his older sister dying from tuberculosis. So tuberculosis is a potentially fatal mycobacterial infection that primarily affects the lungs. There was and is nothing remotely romantic about the disease, and the most common form of human tuberculosis usually begins with flu-like symptoms. It progresses to a persistent cough with spurting of blood caused by a lesion of lung tissue, and consequently comes along with weight loss and general wasting of the muscles. Despite these symptoms, Charlotte Bronte, who wrote in 1849 that consumption, I'm aware, is a flattering malady. And she wrote this, interestingly, at a time when she had just lost her sister Anne that year. And it was the year after her sister Emily had died from tuberculosis as well. The illness was actually at the time considered to be a hereditary disease. And this was due to a lack of knowledge. It was known as a family disease because many members of the same family would catch the illness. And this was due to the fact that it was a communicable disease and they were in close proximity. So the social construct of tuberculosis began to change as the century progressed, and it was destabilized by the emerging biomedical model of tuberculosis that challenged societal ideas around it. Prior to this, the disease was often seen as a mysterious, ethereal, wasting disease, and so the framing of it as a physical illness was important. Rosenberg has suggested that a disease doesn't really exist until it's named, and that the actual diagnosis of it is a really key event to this. The disease then shifted from the romantic notions to an identifiable bacterial infection by the end of the 19th century, and this led to a change in language and understanding of the illness when it moved from consumption to tuberculosis. As the 20th century progressed, it was no longer a disease that endowed the person with improved morals or artistic talent. It became a public health problem that led to isolation and stigma, as societal understandings and perceptions changed because social distancing and environmental controls were seen as vital to stop the spread. And this did actually lead to a decrease in the number of deaths and cases from TB several decades before effective antimicrobials were even available. People with the condition went from being really visible in popular media and romanticized to hidden through isolation and also being feared due to the contagiousness of the actual illness. The illness and the depictions had changed and evolved across this time period. And despite the slow changes, the societal perceptions of consumption during the period do raise questions of the visibility of those who were impacted by the illness. So were people feeling forced to meet societal expectations of the illness? And if they did resist, how did they do this? The romantic idealization of the illness and the many depictions of it have allowed for the concealment of much of the actual real social disadvantages that many who had consumption actually faced. Within the context of being morally strong, pious, and ethereal, could they really truly express their everyday lived experiences? And is this what we see when we're looking in primary sources? Really interestingly, Emily Bronte, who was part of the Bronte family, who most of them died from tuberculosis, she wrote Wuthering Heights, and she really challenged the societal expectations of the illness. So one of the characters, Linton, is despised by Nellie, not because she views him as weak or as lazy, but because he isn't expressing the gratitude to the caregiving that she gives him. As a character, he is victimized through her belief of how an individual with tuberculosis should behave and that they should be grateful for any care regardless of the quality or consistency. Alex Sangard, who wrote Tuberculosis and Disabled Identity in the 19th century literature, has pointed out that Linton's refusal to be grateful for actions that are condescending might actually reflect resentment at being forced into the romantic tropes of the time period. And given that the London Medical and Surgical Journal had described consumption in a positive term, any approach to text on the disease has to be conscious of the social construct the disease existed within, and it involves a really layered approach that understands the audience the texts are written for, the time period and social construct, as well as the intersecting issues of identity which determined a person's everyday lived experience. So understanding the overlapping social identities of a person's lived experience, as well as the spheres in which they exist, is vital to helping to build a much more fuller picture of the historical lives. As shown with the consumption example, perceptions of certain diseases can be fluid and transition over time and within social spheres, and this creates a liminality of experience. Now, this is really important because many approach depictions of disability in this time period as static. If I was to ask many people, say a random person in the street, what they would have thought of in regards to disability in the 19th century, they might describe workhouses and asylums, and they would most likely use what Maria Frawley has described as metaphors of confinement. So these depictions are really static and simplistic because they overlook the agency and the voice of the actual disabled person within the situation. Harriet Martineau, who wrote Life in the Sick Room, a piece of work that reflects on her own lived experience while providing guidance to others who might be disabled, stated that the invalid, who, though he must be a prisoner, yet has liberty of choice where his prison will be. Basically saying that even if you are going to be unwell and using metaphors in confinement, jailed in a sick room, you can still choose the location of the sick room. So say if you wanted to be beside the seaside or somewhere that had pleasant memories for you, you have a level of agency within that. A sick room might hide a person behind the four walls, and in doing so, it creates a physical invisibility. But when a person becomes ill, they become really invisible socially because they have then been othered. The sick room both exposes the illness as well as hiding the person. But at the same time, it's not the static fixed thing, it's permeable because the invalid, the disabled person, can control who enters by choosing their doctor, permitting and refusing visitors, and they're not isolated or cut off from the outside world as many people would believe. The physical space, much like the social, remains betwixt and between that of the able-bodied and the disabled world, cycling through various conditions of visibility. So this liminality can also be seen furthermore in Harriet Martineau's fictional short story, The Deaf Playmate Story. This story involves a protagonist who is gradually losing their hearing and struggling with the invisibility of that condition. They state that their best friend Charlie used to seem not to believe that there was anything the matter with me. The protagonist slowly experiences numerous liminality rituals, which gradually strip him of his different social statuses as he becomes more disabled through the story. So he loses his academic standing, his friends, his wider social circle. He's left feeling isolated, othered, and not really a full member of the school in which he attends. The sudden loss of elements that helped form his identity lead him to question his place and his actions. He begins to doubt himself, and when accused of idleness or stupidity, he states, "I even thought so myself too, and I was very miserable." It shows how many people who are disabled experienced an extended or even perpetual state of liminality due to confusion and a lack of acceptance from others, as well as understanding of the conditions that they had. So while The Deaf Playmate Story is fictional and it is semi-autobiographical in regards to Harriet Martineau's own life, the invisibility and liminality of disabled people is also present in non-fictional mediums. So there's adverts, which you can see here. And this one actually happens to be one of my favorites. And it has this fabulous question, are you only half a woman? And I think it really depicts the complexities of identity, visibility, and liminality, especially when you have an ongoing health condition. So for example, it says, do you feel run down and out of sorts, debilitated, weak, and languid? And it's just this perfect epitome of capturing all these elements all in the one area. So through exploring the writings of disabled people such as Harriet, these writings can provide insight for able-bodied people into the lives of disabled people and serve an educational purposes, at times appearing to challenge the status quo that existed by highlighting inequalities. The problem is there's also internalized ableism, and they can perpetuate it. So Harriet Martineau wrote in Letter to the Deaf that the redeeming quality of personal infirmity is that it brings a special duty with it, but this privilege waits long to be recognized. The special duty of the deaf is in the first place to spare other people as much fatigue as possible. So while she gives visibility to this condition, she also makes deaf people actually invisible. It raises awareness, but also encourages deaf people to not make their disability evident and fatigue the able-bodied audience by actually asking to seek accommodations or accessibility needs. The duality of the audience within the text is also key. So within her writing, she is writing both to a disabled audience and a non-disabled audience. And it's important to look at the careful ways in which the writer chooses to express themselves publicly and only show parts of their lived experience, because the rest will remain hidden. And it's really within the everyday mundane that you find within letters that helps build a really fuller picture of the everyday lived experience of disabled people, because, you know, it's away from the dramatic 19th century literary examples that aren't always informed by a public audience or a medical audience, such as patient case notes, but that are hidden within the everyday, in which you find these real examples. So it can be really easy to approach these things in a black and white sort of a way, but when you do that, you really miss all the things that are in the grey. And it is often there that you can find a route to the answer. So description can be thin or it can be thick. So a thick description is not merely a description of the phenomenon, but provides a wider account of the physical, sociocultural context in which it arises, as well as the individuals involved, either directly or indirectly. Clifford Geertz has shown this because thick description ensures that a researcher can understand the difference between a wink and a blink, and can see which is a social construct and which is a physical construct, because without understanding wider sociocultural influences, the act of a wink or a blink is open to multiple interpretations. And all the various layers that distinguish between a wink and a blink are vital to understanding which is which. The base representation of disability, the very voice of the disabled, are hidden within layers of invisibility, which doesn't just impact figures, you know, historical figures' identity, but their representation and their lived experience. For example, Florence Nightingale identified as an invalid. This is a really key part of her identity, but isn't reflected in many of the depictions of her. The conditions of visibility that have affected historical figures impact the access to primary sources in the present, because disabled history rarely has its own section within the archives, but is also depicting the representation of disabled figures in the present, so that young people growing up aren't getting to see their actual histories represented. My research is a little bit like an onion. So as I peel back the various layers of gender, age, race, and the social constructions of disability that impact the conditions of visibility of a condition, so from the romantic ideals of consumption to the isolation and fear of a communicable disease in the 20th century in which people were isolated and hidden, my research seeks to explore how disability was depicted and the impact that this has on conditions of visibility as social constructs of illness adapt and change, not solely on society and the practice of medicine, but also, really importantly, on the impact on the individual. Through exploring and recording disability history, it's really important to not only just correct the historical narrative that has mainly depicted white, upper-class, able-bodied males, but to ensure that disabled people in the present and the future are able to access their history as easily as anyone else. Given that 1 in 4 20-year-olds are going to be disabled by the time they retire, I personally feel that the work to ensure disabled history is recorded and disseminated widely is really a timely issue and very important. My hope is that my research can help add to that. So thank you, and any questions?
Thank you very much. That was very, very interesting. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, please do ask them. But before we start that, can I ask just one question?
Yeah, go for it.
How do these different social perceptions of new diseases change, like compare now to then? And does social media have an effect on how quickly these perceptions change?
I think social media is definitely changing the landscape. It's a really interesting area, and I know that my university is currently doing research into COVID-19 and people's lived experiences while in isolation and quarantine. But I think the difference is that information back then moved slower. So while there may have been myths and common misperceptions that were known widely in society, they did adapt and change over time. Whereas nowadays, certain things that are blatantly false can spread really, really quickly and a lot quicker here and do an awful lot more damage. I think the 19th century is a nice time to sort of watch things more slowly transition. It's a lot more difficult nowadays to try and keep up with the constant change because there is so much information out there. The one difference I think though is nowadays there's so much information, the internet even can be archived. So if you go to the Wayback Machine, you can see stuff that existed. Whereas when I'm trying to go back and find information, what is kept is what is seen as important. So sometimes disabled history and the lives of disabled people isn't kept and recorded and kept in the archives. So when I'm going back and trying to trace these changes in society, it can be a little bit more difficult. And so if I'm going to newspapers, I have to be really conscious about who is writing So a prime example would be if we think about suicide in the 19th century and how it was depicted, men were usually seen as dying for glory or for some glorious reason, whereas women were seen to have died for a romantic reason. And there was a huge amount of sensationalism and almost romanticism around it. And so suicide notes would actually be within the press and fully published with depictions of the person's life, what happened. And most of the time when it came to female figures, there were representations of maybe a broken heart. And this is the problem, is that what I'm seeing is the newspaper depiction that reflects a societal expectation of what suicide was. So I think, was it a lot of the time people thought women, because they were in the domestic sphere, were safe from suicide. And so there was an awful lot more sensationalism when that did happen. But again, even when you get the actual letter from the person, you have to be aware that there's this social construct about what suicide is that could be permeating into the letter. What I find really interesting, though, is a lot of the language within the letters would reflect language that we would see today in letters. So a lot of the emotions, the thoughts, and the actual experience of it is very similar. And I think if we look back then to sort of see experiences then, we can kind of trace how far we as a society have come. So if we look at PIP and capita and different issues of disability and welfare, we can look at the 1834 Poor Law and realize that when it comes to categorizing disabled people and seeing who is deserving and not deserving, we may not have moved on really far from the Victorian period as we might like to have thought we have. So I don't know if that answers it. It's a bit rambly, but the thing is, there's so much there.
Yeah, I can see. Thank you. Very interesting. We also have one question on the chat from Christina, which she's asking, how are you planning to get to the younger generations?
So I actually do a lot of disability activism currently in regards to different things. So I'm part of NI Disabled Leaders. And if anybody is interested in, maybe, it doesn't have to be disabled history, but it's what I was starting to do. I was doing a version of researcher's art, which is what we do at Swansea University. And so I was trying to get other people to take their research, depict it in some sort of art form to put it out in social media, just while we're all stuck in our own homes. Because I figure sometimes a picture can say an awful lot more maybe than words can say. And also what I've really found with doing that is when you present work to different audiences, sometimes they pick up on different things. So I recently went to a Swansea Association of Independent Living and presented my research there. So it was a non-academic audience, but they were really receptive to it. I've also discussed with my supervisor maybe going out into schools and trying to get more disability history into the curriculum and introducing it there. But there's lots of different ways through activism and trying to find little areas on Twitter and different groups who are interested in taking on projects, because there are people out there who want to do disability history, and when they find out that this is something they can do, there is an appetite. It's just providing a platform for people to then access that.
Interesting, thank you. We have another question on the chat from Sean. He says, he's a great talk. And then he's saying, I was wondering whether there were cases of people actively erasing disabled narratives.
So this is a wee bit complicated, because when you're erasing something, you're erasing it. I would say that a lot of the erasure comes from the fact that disability wasn't necessarily seen always in a positive manner. We're coming at a time in the Industrial Revolution where, you know, the idea of disability actually really arose in the 19th century. So terms like norm, normate, and average really began to exist. And so anything that deviated from that wasn't really seen as being economically viable. And you had to really be deserving to fit within certain categories. So a child who is disabled might get more Christian aid than, say, someone who is an adult. When it comes to the active erasure, sometimes if a man was disabled, it was kind of seen almost as an effeminate thing, because if you think of someone who goes from being the breadwinner to needing welfare or assistance, so for some people that can be emasculating. And so they set up things like friendly societies, which were across Wales and England. even up in Scotland. And these would provide minors with kind of like a safety net. And friendly societies are really cool. They are kind of a mixture. I don't want to say necessarily the Freemasons, but they have all these really cool hand gestures so that they can secretly message each other during a meeting. And they have these really interesting rules. So if your wife shows up at a meeting, you have to pay a fine. If you don't bring a glass to the meeting, if you don't drink at the meeting, if you're a bailiff, you're out. If you have a venereal disease, you're kicked out. But they were like an insurance scheme with kind of Freemason type overtones. And these would ensure that people could be noble in not actively seeking assistance from the state or welfare elsewhere. It was kind of seen as a way of being self-reliant, sort of everyone helping each other depend on that. And so this is kind of where like the erasure kind of comes in, because when people see things as effeminate or not noble, if there's certain historical figures who we think of as being heroic or significant, some have felt that focusing on a disability or an illness can take away from that without really understanding that the lived experience of that may have influenced their decisions they made. So Florence Nightingale may have been influenced by her own lived experience in what she did, and yet it isn't seen as really important to the narrative. So it's not necessarily an active, conscious decision at times. It can sometimes be this really unconscious bias that people have in how they're erasing it, especially when you look at a time period where it was kind of seen as effeminate at times, and deviating from the norm and not necessarily desirable. So again, it goes back to like the suicide notes where a man has died for glory and a woman has died for religious reasons. So erasure is one of those funny things. You can actively exclude it from a narrative, or you can choose to depict it in a particular way. So the nobilism of a male suicide compared to the sort of hysterical suicide of a woman, which isn't really fair. But unfortunately, there's these social contexts and understandings. Suicide was even considered to be a crime. And what I found really interesting was sort of around the start of the century, when it was considered a crime, they would take your body and bury it at a crossroads with a stake through the heart. And the idea was that, say, a spirit had sort of led the person astray to then die by suicide. And in doing this, by putting a stake through the heart, you stop the spirit from rising from the body. And if the spirit then did escape the body and rise, it would be confused by the crossroads, so it couldn't get to somebody else to then cause them to die by suicide. Although at this time period, there are some who theorized that the media's representation of suicide did sort of lead to the suicide contagion where we see nowadays, where sometimes one and the media depictions lead to more. And so sometimes looking at the past, we can see echoes of what is happening now that we might think are brand new, but they're really not, because they're reflected again and again. And so looking to the past can help us really learn and prepare for the now and see things that are occurring now in all these different patterns. So it's long and winding, but I hope it answers it.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting.